The moment Mamie Walker rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1873, every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing and stared, because a woman riding alone with a carpetbag strapped to a gray mare and a rifle balanced across her lap was not something you saw every day in a town that had nearly forgotten what hope looked like. Dusty Creek was not a prosperous place. It sat at the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert like something the land had coughed up and never bothered to reclaim. The buildings leaned against each other the way tired men do after a long day, and the dust was so constant and so thick that it had settled into the wrinkles of every face in town, making even the youngest residents look older than their years. There was a general store run by a man named Hector Pyle, who watered down his whiskey and charged double for sugar. There was a livery stable, a small church without a preacher, and a saloon called the Red Cactus that served both as the social center and the source of most of the town's trouble. And there was a small newspaper office, the Dusty Creek Courier, which had not printed a single edition in 4 months because its owner, old Earl Sutton, had died of fever in January and left the press to nobody in particular. That press was why Mamie Walker had come. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that caught the afternoon light and turned it copper, and green eyes that had a way of looking at things with a precision that made people feel they were being measured, and not always found adequate. She was not a delicate woman, not in the way the magazines of the era described women as delicate, but she carried herself with a kind of quiet determination that was its own form of grace. She had learned typesetting in St. Louis from her father, who had run a small printing operation until a fire took the building, and a broken heart over the loss took him 6 months later. Mamie had survived both losses, had taken the small inheritance her mother left her before she too passed, and had answered an advertisement she found in a Kansas City paper. Press equipment available in Dusty Creek, NM Territory. Opportunity for a person of enterprise and nerve. Mamie had both. She tied her mare to the post outside the general store and pushed through the door, the little bell above the frame announcing her arrival to Hector Pyle, who was already watching her from behind a counter laden with bolts of fabric and tins of tobacco. "I am looking for whoever oversees the property of the late Earl Sutton," she said, setting her carpetbag on the floor with a solid thump. "I understand his press and the newspaper office are available." Hector Pyle scratched the back of his neck and looked at her the way men in small towns often looked at women who asked direct questions, with a mixture of surprise and mild disapproval that he was trying to dress up as helpfulness. "Well now," he said slowly, "that would be a matter for Monroe Barker to sort out. He is sort of the one who keeps things together around here. Not the sheriff, mind you, we do not have one of those at present, but he handles disputes and such. Has a ranch about 2 miles east, but you might find him at the Red Cactus this time of day. He usually comes in for supper when Clara is cooking." Mamie thanked him, picked up her carpetbag, and walked back out into the dust and the sunlight. The Red Cactus smelled of wood smoke and frying onions when she pushed through its swinging doors, which was a better smell than she had expected. The afternoon crowd was thin, a couple of old men playing cards near the window, a young cowhand nursing a beer at the bar, and a woman behind the counter, stout and capable-looking, stirring something in a pot on the stove behind her. That had to be Clara. And then there was Monroe Barker. Mamie recognized him immediately as the kind of man a room organizes itself around without quite meaning to. He was sitting at a table near the back wall, not in a showy way, but settled into his chair with the ease of a man who was comfortable in his own skin. He was somewhere around 28 or 29, with broad shoulders that spoke to years of physical work, dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that carried about 3 days of growth. He was reading something, a ledger of some kind, with a furrow between his brows that suggested the numbers were not making him happy. He had a cup of coffee at his elbow and his hat hung on the back of his chair, and for just a moment before she walked toward him, Mamie Walker thought that he looked like a man carrying a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was there. She walked across the room and stopped at his table. "Excuse me," she said. "I am looking for Monroe Barker." He looked up, and for just a fraction of a second the furrow between his brows smoothed out entirely before it came back, which told her that whatever he had been expecting, it had not been her. "You found him," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, a voice that matched the man. "I am Mamie Walker. I have come about the Sutton newspaper office and press. I want to purchase the rights and restart the Courier." Monroe Barker set down his ledger and leaned back in his chair, and the look he gave her was not dismissive, which surprised her, but it was cautious. "Miss Walker," he said, "have a seat." She sat, and he called over to Clara for another cup of coffee, and then he looked at her with those dark, careful eyes and said, "Earl Sutton was a friend of mine. He left the property to the town by way of a loose arrangement, meaning nobody formally owns it and nobody has done anything with it. I have been paying the building's tax from my own pocket to keep it from being seized, because I believe a town without a newspaper is a town that is losing its memory." He paused. "I did not expect anyone to come answer that advertisement. Corbett over in Silver City placed it mostly as a formality. He did not think anyone would respond." "I did," Mamie said. "I can see that." He studied her for a moment. "What do you know about running a newspaper in a territory that has no law enforcement, a cattle baron trying to buy up every parcel of land inside of 40 miles, and a population that is equally suspicious of good news and bad?" Mamie wrapped both hands around the coffee cup Clara set in front of her and met Monroe Barker's eyes without flinching. "I know that a newspaper is the only thing standing between a community and the people who want to run it without accountability," she said. "My father ran a paper in St. Louis. I learned every part of the operation from the time I was 12 years old. I can set type, I can operate a Washington hand press, I can write, and I can edit. I have $200 saved, which is enough to buy ink and paper stock and get the first several editions printed." She paused. "I also know that whatever that cattle baron is doing to this town, the only way to stop him is to put it in print where everyone can read it." Monroe Barker was quiet for a long moment. Then a slow, careful smile moved across his face, the kind of smile that had been a while arriving and was not entirely sure it should have come out. "His name is Cord Blevins," Monroe said. "He owns the Broken Bee Ranch, which is about 15 miles north of here, and he has been buying up water rights and grazing land for 3 years. 2 families have already been pushed off their spreads. He wants the land this town sits on because there is talk of a railroad spur coming through, and whoever controls the land controls the money." He paused. "He is not a man who takes kindly to opposition." "Then it is a good thing I am not particularly concerned with what he takes kindly to," Mamie said. Monroe looked at her for another long moment, then picked up his coffee cup and nodded slowly, as if he had made a decision he was not entirely sure was wise and had made it anyway. "The building is yours, Miss Walker. I will sign over the arrangement tomorrow morning. The press is old, but it works. Earl kept it in good condition." He set his cup down. "I should tell you, this town could use what you are offering. It could use it badly." "Then we are in agreement," Mamie said. She slept that night in the room above the newspaper office, which had been Earl Sutton's quarters and still held his books and his reading glasses and a faded photograph of a woman who was probably his wife. Mamie moved these things gently to a shelf, made up the narrow bed with the blanket from her carpetbag, and lay in the dark listening to the desert wind move against the window. She thought about her father's paper in St. Louis. She thought about the long road that had brought her here, through grief and uncertainty, and a dozen small moments of doubt that she had pressed down and walked past. And she thought, briefly and without quite meaning to, about Monroe Barker's eyes, which had been careful and intelligent, and had held something she had not been able to name, something like a question waiting for the right person to come along and answer it. She pushed that thought aside and went asleep. The next morning was all business. Monroe arrived at the newspaper office at 8 o'clock with 2 cups of coffee from Clara's kitchen and a handwritten document transferring stewardship of the building and its contents to Mamie Walker for a period of 2 years, at which point the arrangement would be reviewed. He had also brought, without being asked, a young man named Toby Reeves, who was 17 and apparently willing to do almost any job in town for small pay because his family's farm had dried up the previous summer. Toby was lean and sun-browned with an eager expression and hands that were already calloused from hard work. "He can help you with the heavy lifting and the deliveries," Monroe said. "He is a good worker." Mamie looked at the press. It was a Washington hand press from approximately 1860, well-made and solid, its iron frame gleaming faintly with the oil Earl Sutton had kept it coated in. The type cases were intact, though some letters needed sorting back into their proper compartments. The paper stock was low but not gone. There was enough ink for perhaps 3 editions if she was careful. "I will need more ink and paper within the month," she said to Monroe. "I will write to a supplier in Santa Fe today. I can carry the letter to the post rider," Toby said. "He comes through Thursdays." "Good," Mamie said. She looked around at the dusty but functional office, at the stacks of old Courier issues on the shelf, at the light coming through the single east-facing window. She felt something settle inside her chest, something that had been restless for a long time, maybe since her father died, maybe even before that. This was the work. This was what she knew. "We have a paper to put out." Monroe watched her begin sorting through the type cases with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times, and something in his expression shifted, something that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration, but was moving in the direction of both. "I will leave you to it then," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Barker," Mamie said, without looking up from the type. "Monroe," he said, "we are a small town. Formalities do not survive long out here." She looked up at that just briefly, and a small smile crossed her face. "Thank you, Monroe." He left and she went back to work, and outside the window Dusty Creek carried on in its tired, dusty way, not yet knowing that something had arrived that was going to change it. The first edition of the restarted Dusty Creek Courier came out on a Tuesday, 12 days after Mamie's arrival. It was 4 pages, printed on both sides of 2 sheets of good paper that Mamie had sourced from Hector Pyle's back stock, paying more than she should have, but having no other immediate option. The front page carried a brief history of the paper and a statement of purpose from Mamie herself, written in the plain, clear style her father had taught her. A newspaper's job is to tell the truth and to tell it plainly, with fairness to the facts and none to the powerful. The second page carried news from across the territory, compiled from back issues of the Santa Fe New Mexican, and a letter from a correspondent in Albuquerque. The third page had a column on farming conditions and a brief piece on the proposed railroad. And at the bottom of the fourth page was a short item, carefully worded, noting that several residents of Dusty Creek's surrounding townships had raised concerns about the consolidation of water rights in the region, and that the Courier would be following this matter closely in coming editions. It was a careful, opening gambit, not a full broadside against Cord Blevins, but a signal that the paper was watching. Monroe read his copy, standing at the bar of the Red Cactus, with Clara peering over his shoulder. "She is something," Clara said, which from Clara, who was not given to easy compliments, was high praise indeed. Monroe folded the paper and tucked it into his vest pocket and did not say anything, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that Clara noticed and filed away for later consideration. The reaction from town was mostly positive. People had missed having a paper. They missed the sense of connection it gave to the larger world, the feeling that their small, dust-choked corner of the territory was still part of something, still counted for something. Old men who had not left their porches in months came down to the newspaper office to buy copies. A woman named Ruth Hardin, who ran the boarding house 2 streets over, pressed Mamie's hand and said, "Earl would be so pleased," with tears in her eyes. The reaction from Cord Blevins was something else entirely. He arrived in town 4 days after the paper came out, riding at the head of a group of 5 riders who were all large and deliberate-looking in the way of men who were paid to be. Blevins himself was a man in his early 50s, broad and heavy, with a face that had hardened into something like stone over the years, with pale eyes that held the flat certainty of a man who had not been told no in a very long time. He went directly to the newspaper office, which told Mamie that someone in town had told him where to go, which told her something useful about the loyalties in Dusty Creek. Mamie was setting type for the second edition when he walked in. She did not stop working. "Miss Walker," Blevins said. His voice was the kind of voice that was used to filling rooms. "I have come to introduce myself." "Mr. Blevins," Mamie said, still not looking up. "I know who you are." He was silent for a moment, apparently unaccustomed to being addressed by someone who was simultaneously ignoring him. "That little item in your paper about water rights," he said. "It was inaccurate." "It stated that residents had raised concerns," Mamie said, finally looking up at him with her green eyes steady and clear. "That is accurate. Whether those concerns are justified is a matter we will explore through continued reporting." Blevins looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked around the office, taking in the press and the type cases and the stacks of paper with the assessing gaze of a man calculating costs. "This is a small operation," he said finally. "It is," Mamie agreed. "And it will continue to be an honest one." The pale eyes held hers for another beat, and then Blevins turned and walked out, his riders filling the doorway briefly before following him, and the little bell above the door rang bright and sharp in the silence he left behind. Mamie let out a slow, quiet breath, then picked up her composing stick and went back to work. Monroe came by that evening. He had heard about the visit, as everyone in town had heard about it within approximately 45 minutes, because news in a small town travels faster than wire telegraph. "You handled that well," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I told him the truth and held my ground," Mamie said. "That is not particularly difficult." "With Cord Blevins it is," Monroe said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite worry and not quite admiration, but was close to both, and had other things mixed in that he was keeping to himself. He came inside and sat down in the chair across from her work table, which was something he had been doing in the evenings with increasing frequency over the past 2 weeks, usually with some practical reason, a piece of local information she needed for a story, a connection to a source in the territory, a detail about the town's history, but sometimes without any particular reason at all. Mamie had noticed. She was not a woman who missed things. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, not looking up from the type she was sorting. "You do not seem like the kind of man who ended up here by accident." Monroe was quiet for a moment. "My father homesteaded the land in 1861. I was 15. He built the house and the first barn himself. When he died in 1868, he left it to me." He paused. "I have spent the years since keeping it together. Alone. My foreman, a man named Pete Garza, has been with me since I was 18. He is invaluable. And I have 2 ranch hands, brothers named Sam and Dill Vickers, who are decent workers." He looked at his hands. "But yes, mostly alone." There was something in the way he said that last word, "mostly alone," that was very quiet and very honest, the kind of honesty people offer when they are not quite planning to and then cannot take it back. Mamie looked up from her work and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the evening light through the single window was going amber and warm, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You have done well," she said finally, gently, meaning more than the ranch. Meaning all of it, the years, the solitude, the weight she had noticed that first day. Monroe nodded slowly, and his eyes stayed on hers a beat longer than they needed to, and then he cleared his throat and said, "I should let you get on with your work," and stood up. "You do not have to go," Mamie said. The words came out before she had fully decided to say them. Monroe paused. "I have been alone in this office most evenings," she said, more carefully now, "and I find the company agreeable." He sat back down. After a moment, he picked up a copy of the previous week's edition from her work table, and began to read it again, and Mamie went back to setting type, and the evening settled around them both like something that had been waiting patiently for exactly this arrangement. The second edition of the Courier went further. Mamie had spent the intervening week speaking with every family she could reach within a 10-mile radius, taking notes in her small, precise handwriting, gathering names and dates, and the specific terms under which Cord Blevins had acquired the water rights that now effectively controlled 3 separate creek tributaries feeding the ranches south of town. 2 families, the Millers and the Hawthorns, had signed over their rights under what they described as significant pressure, including implied threats to their livestock, and one incident in which a Miller barn had caught fire under circumstances that were never formally investigated because there was no law present to investigate them. Mamie printed all of it. She named Blevins. She named dates. She quoted the families directly. Monroe read the edition before it went out because she had asked him to, trusting his knowledge of local circumstances to flag anything that was factually wrong. "This is going to light a fire," he said, setting the proof sheet down. "That is rather the point," Mamie said. He looked at her. Mamie. It was the first time he had used her first name, and they both noticed it, though neither remarked on it. "Blevins has money and men and the ear of the Territorial Land Office. You are one woman with a press." "I am one woman with a press and the truth," she said. "In my experience, that combination is underestimated by powerful men until it is too late for them." Monroe was quiet for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "I am going to worry about you." "Then worry," she said, equally quietly, "but do not ask me to stop." He did not ask her to stop. He did something instead that she had not expected, which was to send Pete Garza, his foreman, to sleep in the livery stable adjacent to the newspaper office on the nights the paper went out, as a quiet, unannounced precaution. Mamie discovered this arrangement through Toby, who had seen Pete arrive with his bedroll, and when she confronted Monroe about it the next morning, he simply looked at her with those steady, dark eyes and said, "Pete volunteered. He likes you. He says you remind him of his mother, which is the highest compliment he gives anyone." Mamie found that she could not maintain her objection in the face of that particular piece of information. The response to the second edition was electric. Within 2 days, every copy was gone. People from ranches as far as 15 miles out were riding in to buy a copy or have one read to them if they could not read themselves. The Miller family, Tom and Alice Miller, came to the newspaper office in person to thank Mamie, Alice gripping her hands and saying over and over that she had not believed anyone would listen, that she had given up thinking anyone would care. "The Courier cares," Mamie said. "And this community cares. Cord Blevins did not come in person this time. He sent a man, a lawyer from Santa Fe named Whitmore, who arrived with a letter threatening legal action for defamation and demanded a printed retraction in the next edition." Mamie read the letter carefully, set it down on her work table, and wrote a response informing Mr. Whitmore that the Courier stood behind every fact in its reporting and invited Mr. Blevins to submit a written statement of his position, which would be printed in full in the next edition, alongside any factual corrections that were warranted. Whitmore looked at her as if she were a particularly unusual species of wildlife. "He will not be satisfied with that," the lawyer said. "He is welcome to be unsatisfied," Mamie said pleasantly. Monroe, who had been present for this exchange, escorted Whitmore to the door afterward with a politeness that was entirely genuine and entirely inflexible, and when the lawyer was gone, he turned back to Mamie with an expression that was difficult to interpret, part exasperation, part something warmer. "You know," he said, "most people who come through Dusty Creek are trying to leave." "I came here to stay," Mamie said simply. Something shifted in Monroe's expression at that. Something quiet and significant, like a door opening in a wall that has been solid for a long time. "Good," he said, just that one word. But the way he said it, careful and certain and entirely without his usual guardedness, made Mamie's chest do something complicated that she chose to examine later when she was alone. The weeks that followed were busy ones, full of the constant work of putting out a weekly paper in a town with limited resources and a growing readership that was hungry for more. Mamie sent letters to correspondents in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and El Paso, building a network of news sources. She began a column on territorial politics and another on practical matters for homesteaders, covering topics like water conservation, crop rotation, and the legal rights of settlers, the last of which Mamie was essentially learning alongside her readers by writing to legal contacts in the East. She and Monroe fell into a rhythm that neither of them had quite planned. He came to the office most evenings, sometimes with information, sometimes with supper from Clara's kitchen, which he began bringing with enough regularity that Clara had taken to preparing a second portion without being asked. They talked about the paper, about the town, about the territory, and gradually about other things, older things, the St. Louis of Mamie's childhood, the particular quality of light on the desert in winter that Monroe had watched every year since he was 15, the books they had both read in scattered, occasional ways, whatever came their way in a place where books were rare and therefore precious. Monroe had a copy of Tennyson that his mother had carried all the way from Virginia before the war. Mamie had a battered copy of Jane Eyre that she had read so many times the spine had been restitched twice. One evening she brought it to the table where he was sitting and set it down beside him, and he looked at it and then looked at her with a small, curious smile. "My foreman Pete claims I read too much for a rancher," Monroe said. "Your foreman Pete sounds like a man of opinions," Mamie said, settling across from him. "He has many," Monroe said. "His current opinion is that I should be spending less time in town. And what do you say to that?" "I say that a man has to see to the interests of the community," Monroe said, and his eyes were warm with that particular warmth that had been building in them over weeks, steady and deep and entirely directed at her. "That is a very reasonable answer," Mamie said, and she was looking at her work and not at him, but she was smiling, and he saw it. It was Clara who pushed things along, as Clara tended to do, being a woman of directness and no patience for the circling that two cautious people engaged in when they were both too sensible and too frightened to say what they were feeling outright. She came to the newspaper office one afternoon under the pretense of bringing pie, which she did actually bring, but also to say to Mamie with perfect bluntness, while Toby was conveniently out on an errand, "That man has not looked at anything the way he looks at you in about 10 years. And I knew his wife." Mamie looked up from her work. "He was married?" she asked, keeping her voice careful. "She died in 1870, Clara said, sitting down in the visitor's chair and setting the pie on the edge of the work table. "Fever. They had only been married 2 years. Her name was Eliza. She was a good woman and he loved her, and when she died he closed off like a house being shuttered for winter, and nobody has been able to get a window open since." Clara looked at Mamie steadily. "Until you." Mamie was quiet for a moment, absorbing this, fitting it against the things she had observed, the weight she had noticed that first day, the careful way he measured everything before he gave it, the way even his smiles had a quality of careful guardedness to them, as if they were being loaned out rather than freely given. "He has not said anything," Mamie said. "He will not," Clara said, "unless he believes it will be received well. Monroe Barker does not do things halfway, and he will not say a word about what he feels until he is certain he will not be making a mistake or causing you distress." She paused. "I am telling you what I know because I am old enough to know that sensible, cautious people can waste a great deal of time waiting for certainty that life does not actually provide." She left the pie and departed, and Mamie sat for a long time with her hands flat on the work table, thinking about Monroe Barker and shuttered houses in winter, and the particular way he said good evening when he arrived and good night when he left, as if each of those ordinary phrases was carrying more than its usual weight. It was a Thursday in late summer when things moved. The evening had come in cooler than usual, a hint of the autumn that was still a month away, and Monroe had brought supper and they had eaten it together at the work table with the front door open to catch the breeze, talking about the piece Mamie was writing on the proposed railroad and the land deals that would follow it. When the food was done and cleared away, there was a moment of quiet that had a different quality than the usual comfortable quiet, more charged, waiting for something. Monroe stood at the window, looking out at the darkening street, and after a moment he said, without turning around, "I want to tell you something." "All right," Mamie said. He turned around and looked at her, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, the careful watchfulness entirely stripped away. "I have been trying to think of a sensible, measured way to say this," he said. "I have been working on it for about 3 weeks. I keep deciding it is not the right time, or that I am misreading things, or that you came here to build something and the last thing you need is a man making things complicated." "Monroe," Mamie said quietly. "I am falling in love with you," he said, straight and simple and honest, the way the man himself was. "I have been since about the 3rd evening you let me sit in this office and read while you worked. I am not asking you for anything. I am just telling you because I think you deserve to know the truth of it, and because Clara told me this morning that if I did not say something soon she was going to say it for me, which she would absolutely do." Mamie stood up from her chair. She walked across the space between them slowly, and she stood in front of him, close enough to see the way his jaw was set with the effort of having said what he had said and now waiting. And she looked up at him with her green eyes steady and clear and full of something that had been building in her for weeks without her quite admitting it. The way water builds behind a dam until the dam gives way, not because it breaks, but because the pressure has simply become greater than the structure intended to contain it. "I came here to stay," she said softly. "You already know that. And I think you know, Monroe Barker, that the reason this office feels different in the evenings when you are in it is not entirely about the company being agreeable." His breath changed. Something in his whole body shifted, the way a man shifts when he has been holding tension for a long time and is finally permitted to let it go. "Mamie," he said, and the way he said her name was different from every time before, softer and more certain at the same time. He reached up and took her hand where it hung at her side, not pulling her toward him, just taking her hand with a care that was almost unbearably gentle, and she turned her hand to hold his, and they stood like that in the amber evening light while the desert breeze came through the open door, and the sounds of Dusty Creek carried on outside. "I should tell you," she said quietly, "that I have not let myself want this kind of thing for a long time. Since my parents died, I have been very focused on practical matters." "That is understandable," he said. "I am telling you because I want you to know that this is not a small thing for me," she said. "What I am feeling." "It is not a small thing for me either," he said. "Not even slightly." She smiled then, a full and genuine smile that was not guarded at all, and he smiled back at her, and it was the least guarded she had ever seen his face, open and warm and entirely certain. He did not kiss her that evening. He was that kind of man. He walked her to the foot of the stairs that led to her room above the office, still holding her hand, and said good night. And he said it with such warmth and such completeness that she stood at the foot of those stairs for a good minute after he left, just breathing. Toby came in the next morning and found Mamie setting type with the particular focused energy of someone who is very happy and working hard not to show it, and being 17 and observant, he immediately understood the situation entirely. "You and Monroe Barker," he said, grinning. "Set those type cases in order, Toby," Mamie said, but she was smiling too. What followed was a courtship conducted in the particular way of 2 thoughtful adults in a small town in the American Southwest in 1873, which meant it was conducted largely in public, under the cheerful observation of nearly everyone in Dusty Creek. Monroe called at the newspaper office in the evenings and escorted Mamie to Sunday suppers at Clara's, and rode with her on Saturday afternoons when she wanted to visit outlying families for her reporting. They talked constantly, about everything, with the ease of 2 people who had found in each other a conversational equal, which was the rarest thing either of them had experienced. They talked about the land. Monroe loved the land with a depth that was almost geological, not sentimental, but physical and permanent, rooted in the specific reality of this particular ground with its particular light and its particular seasons. He took her riding across the eastern part of his ranch one Saturday afternoon in early September, through a passage of low red hills that opened without warning into a wide valley, where a dry creek bed ran silver in the afternoon light, and the desert sage made the air smell like something ancient and clean. Mamie pulled her mare to a stop at the edge of the valley and looked out at it, and she felt something she had not felt since she was very young, in her father's print shop, surrounded by the smell of ink and paper, with the whole organized world of language spread out before her. She felt that this place was part of her already, or she was part of it, that the connection was not future tense but present, immediate, done. Monroe pulled up beside her and watched her looking out at the valley. "It is beautiful," she said very simply. "Yes," he said, looking at her. She turned and caught him looking, and neither of them looked away. He kissed her that evening on the ride back when they had stopped to let the horses drink at a water trough outside a farmstead they had visited. He brought his horse alongside hers and reached across and touched her face, and she turned toward him, and it was a slow, careful kiss, unhurried and warm, with the desert evening settling around them, and the horses drinking steadily, and somewhere off in the distance, a mockingbird cycling through its repertoire of borrowed songs. When they separated, Mamie looked at him with her green eyes bright and warm, and Monroe looked at her with that open, unguarded expression that she had come to think of as her Monroe, the one beneath the careful public face, the one she had worked 6 weeks to find, and she thought, with a certainty that she had rarely felt about anything, that she would spend a very long time working to keep that expression on his face. Cord Blevins, unfortunately, was not pausing to allow for the natural progression of love. The third edition of the Courier had carried a piece compiled from territorial land records that Mamie had obtained through a contact in Santa Fe, documenting the specific sequence of water rights purchases over the previous 3 years, showing clearly that the purchases had followed a deliberate pattern that effectively encircled the ranches and farmsteads south of town, cutting off their access to the creek tributaries that were their primary water supply. The piece was factual, documented, and devastating. It also included a response from Tom Miller describing in specific detail the evening when 3 of Blevins's riders had come to his farm and made it clear that his refusal to sell would have consequences for his livestock. The retaliation came in the form of a fire. It was 2 in the morning on a Wednesday when Mamie smelled smoke. She was at her work table, finishing the layout for the 4th edition because she kept late hours when a deadline was approaching, which was something Monroe had gently complained about on multiple occasions. She smelled smoke and in the same moment heard Pete Garza's voice at the door, urgent and low. "Miss Walker, get out now, the back of the building." She grabbed the layout sheets she had been working on, which was perhaps not the most sensible priority but was instinctive, and she went down the stairs and through the front door into the cool night air, and turned to see orange light blooming from the back corner of the building, the small wood store where she kept paper stock and ink. Pete had already organized a bucket line from the well. Clara had arrived, seemingly from nowhere, wrapped in a shawl over her nightclothes. Half a dozen men from town came running, and within 20 minutes the fire was out, contained before it reached the press or the main room, though the paper stock was a total loss and the back wall was severely charred. Monroe arrived at a hard run, still buttoning his vest, his face tight with something that was beyond worry. He went directly to Mamie, who was standing in the street watching the smoke from the doused fire drift upward into the dark sky, the layout sheets still in her hands. He put his hands on her arms and looked at her face, checking her for injury with a thoroughness that was tender and urgent at once. "I am fine," she said. "Pete got me out before it spread." Monroe looked at Pete over her shoulder and said, "Thank you," in a voice that carried everything he felt about that. Pete nodded once, with the economy of a man who did not require more acknowledgement than that. Mamie looked at the charred wall and the ruined store and the lost paper stock, and she felt something that she would have called fury if it had been louder, but it was quiet and cold and entirely clear. She thought of the Miller family. She thought of the Hawthorns. She thought of every person in this territory who had been pushed and threatened and driven off by money and force, and she thought of her father's burned print shop in St. Louis and the grief that had followed, and she thought with complete and quiet certainty that she was not going to let this stop her. "I will write to Santa Fe tonight," she said. "The paper stock can be replaced, and tomorrow I am going to write the story about this fire." Monroe was still holding her arms. He looked at her face, reading it the way he had learned to read it over these weeks. "Mamie," he said. "I came here to stay," she said, meeting his eyes. "That has not changed." His jaw tightened, not against her but against the situation, against the fact that the thing he feared most, the moment when her stubborn bravery would put her in actual danger, had arrived already. "I know," he said. "I know you did." He looked at the building, then back at her. "I am going to move some of my people in closer. Pete will stay at the livery. I want Sam Vickers on the street at night. Monroe, I do not want to put your people in danger for my sake." "They are not doing it for your sake alone," Monroe said. "They are doing it because they live here too. Because this is their town, and their paper and cord Blevins has been squeezing this community for 3 years, and every one of them has had enough." He paused. "And because I have asked them." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had been alone for so long, who had built something with such care and such patience and such quiet love, and she thought that the weight she had seen on him that first day was not entirely gone, but it had shifted, become something different, shared, and that she was glad, deeply and thoroughly glad, that she had come to Dusty Creek. "All right," she said softly. He released her arms and stood beside her, and they both looked at the damaged building, and Clara came and pressed a cup of tea into Mamie's hands, and the night went on around them. The story of the fire ran in the 4th edition, which came out on time. Mamie had sourced paper stock from a trader passing through on his way to El Paso, paying too much and not caring. The piece on the fire was factual and specific. Pete Garza had found, in the ashes of the wood store, the charred remnant of a kerosene-soaked rag of a particular blue stripe that 3 people in town recognized as belonging to a man named Deke Curran, who was one of Blevins's riders. Mamie printed this, along with a call for territorial law enforcement to investigate and a direct statement that the Dusty Creek Courier held Cord Blevins responsible for what had occurred. This time the response was not a lawyer. Monroe came to the office 2 days after the edition went out and sat down across from her work table with the expression of a man who had been doing a great deal of thinking. "Blevins has sent word to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe," he said. "He is claiming that the courier is inciting disorder and requesting that the marshal's office take action against you." "Let him," Mamie said. "The territorial marshal will have to come here and look at the evidence and talk to the people who have been affected by Blevins's consolidation scheme, and once he does that, we have won." Monroe looked at her. "That is a significant gamble." "It is based on the assumption that the law, when presented with clear evidence and multiple witnesses, will do what it is supposed to do," Mamie said. "I am aware that this assumption does not always hold, but I think it holds here." She paused. "Does the territorial marshal have any existing relationship with Blevins that I should know about?" Monroe considered this. "Marshal Holden is a fair man by general reputation. He and Blevins have had no particular dealings that I know of." He paused. "But I will write to Holden myself, separately from your reporting, as a landowner and a member of this community. 2 independent accounts of the same pattern will be harder to dismiss." "That would help," Mamie said. He wrote the letter that evening, at the far end of her work table while she set type for the 5th edition, and she could hear the scratch of his pen in the quiet office and feel his presence across the table like something warm and steady. And she thought that this was what she had always wanted without knowing quite how to name it. Not merely the work, important as the work was, but this, someone to sit across from in the lamplit quiet, someone who wrote letters while she set type, and neither of them required constant conversation, because the presence itself was enough. Marshal Holden arrived in Dusty Creek in early October, trailing 2 deputies and a cloud of territorial authority. He was a lean man in his mid-40s with the thorough, methodical manner of someone who had been dealing with complicated situations for a long time and had developed a deep preference for thoroughness over speed. He spent 4 days in Dusty Creek. He read 4 editions of the Courier. He spoke with the Miller family, the Hawthorns, Pete Garza, Ruth Hardin, Hector Pyle, Clara, and a dozen others. He examined the fire damage to the newspaper office and the charred evidence Mamie had preserved. He met with Cord Blevins, who rode in from the Broken Bee, and spent 2 hours in Holden's temporary office at the boarding house emerging with, according to Ruth Hardin, who had pressed her ear to the wall with considerable dedication, significantly less confidence than he had arrived with. He met with Mamie last. She laid out the full documentation she had assembled, the land records, the witness accounts, the timeline, the physical evidence from the fire, all of it organized in her precise, methodical way, and she answered his questions with clarity and without exaggeration. Monroe sat at the back of the room and said nothing because he understood this was Mamie's meeting, Mamie's work, and she did not need him to speak for her. Holden listened to everything. He looked at everything. Then he folded his hands on the table and said, "Miss Walker, in 10 years of territorial law enforcement, I have not been presented with a more thoroughly documented account of land rights violations. This is exceptional work." "Thank you, Marshal," Mamie said. "What will you do about it?" "I am going to recommend that the territorial government conduct a formal investigation into the water rights acquisitions in this county, and I am going to refer the matter of the fire and the intimidation of the Miller family to the territorial courts," he said. "I am also going to place a deputy in Dusty Creek on a rotating basis until this investigation is resolved." He paused. "I would also strongly recommend that you continue publishing. The public record you have created is going to be essential to the prosecution of these matters." After Holden left, Monroe walked with Mamie along the main street of Dusty Creek in the cool October afternoon, both of them quiet for a while, with the particular quiet of people who have been working very hard towards something and have just been told that they have reached the crest of the hill. "You did that," Monroe said eventually. "The town did it," Mamie said. "The Millers and the Hawthorns and Pete and Clara and everyone who talked to Holden. I just organized it into sentences." Monroe stopped walking and turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that was so full and so warm and so entirely certain that Mamie felt it like something physical, like warmth from a fire. "Mamie Walker," he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "I have been alone on that ranch for 5 years," he said, "working and thinking and getting through days that were fine and entirely insufficient, and I had stopped expecting them to be anything else." He looked at her steadily, with complete honesty. "You have been in this town for 5 months. In 5 months you have restarted a newspaper, stood up to a man who has been running roughshod over this community for 3 years, brought the territorial marshal to town, and made me feel, for the first time in a very long time, like the days are not merely something to be gotten through." He took her hand. "I would like to ask if you would consider being my wife." Mamie looked at him for a long, full moment. The October light was pale gold, and the desert smelled of sage and cool air, and somewhere down the street Clara was clattering pots, and someone's horse was making its feelings known about something at the livery. The whole alive, ordinary world of Dusty Creek carried on around them, and in the middle of it stood Monroe Barker, holding her hand and waiting with all the patience of a man who had learned that some things cannot be hurried. "Yes," Mamie said, clear and certain and unhesitating. Monroe's face changed completely. The last of the long winter departed from it, all at once, finally, and what was underneath was something she would spend years learning and never tire of, something warm and open and entirely alive. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was an old-fashioned gesture, and entirely right for a man who was in some ways old-fashioned. And she laughed, a genuine and delighted laugh that she rarely allowed herself, and he smiled at the sound of it with the particularness of a man hearing something very precious. Clara, who had appeared in the doorway of the red cactus at exactly the right moment, said, "Well, finally," loud enough to be heard clearly, and went back inside to start cooking a celebration supper. They were married in December in Dusty Creek's church, which finally had a preacher by then, a traveling Methodist minister named Brother Amos who passed through twice a year and had been delighted to perform the ceremony. The whole town came. Ruth Hardin pressed flowers from her window box between the pages of her Bible and presented them to Mamie as a bouquet. Tom Miller and his wife Alice sat in the second row and smiled with the particular warmth of people who feel they have a stake in the happiness being celebrated, which they did. Pete Garza stood up with Monroe as his witness, and Clara stood with Mamie, and Toby Reeves sat in the front row in his best shirt with his hair wetted down, and managed to stay dry-eyed until the vows were spoken and then did not. The vows were simple and said plainly in front of everyone, and Monroe said his with his eyes on Mamie's face with that expression she had come to think of as the open Monroe, the real Monroe, and Mamie said hers with her voice steady and clear and her green eyes bright. And when it was done and Brother Amos had pronounced them husband and wife, Monroe kissed her in front of everyone in a way that was restrained and entirely inadequate to what he was feeling, because he was a reserved man in some respects. And then Clara began to cry, which set Ruth Hardin off, and Toby Reeves gave up entirely on being dry-eyed, and the whole church was somewhat wetter than expected for a December ceremony. The celebration supper at the Red Cactus went on until midnight. Mamie moved her things to the ranch, though she kept the newspaper office and continued to put out the Courier twice monthly, riding into town on Tuesdays and Fridays with Toby, who had by now become a capable assistant. Monroe rode with her frequently, sometimes staying in town to deal with ranch business while she worked, sometimes just sitting at the far end of the work table writing letters or going over his accounts, the same comfortable presence he had always been in the office, now simply official. The territorial investigation into Cord Blevins moved slowly, as government processes do, but it moved. By February of 1874, the territorial courts had begun hearings on the water rights acquisitions, and it became clear that several of the transactions had been executed under conditions that the court considered coercive. Blevins retained a battery of lawyers and fought every step, but the documented record was too thorough, and the number of witnesses was too great, and his position eroded steadily over the months that followed. In March, the Millers were restored full rights to their creek tributary. The Hawthorns reached a financial settlement that allowed them to rebuild on their land. And Cord Blevins, facing significant legal costs and the loss of the political advantage he had spent 3 years building, sold the Broken Bee Ranch in April and left the territory. He went to Colorado, it was said, where he had interests in a mining operation. Dusty Creek watched him go with a profound collective relief that expressed itself in 3 days of somewhat elevated celebration at the Red Cactus. Mamie ran the story of Blevins's departure in the Courier with a factual, measured account of everything that had happened and what had been resolved and what still needed attention, because that was what a good newspaper did. It did not gloat. It simply reported the truth with care. Tom Miller brought her a jar of his wife's blackberry preserves as a thank you. Clara made a point of giving Mamie a double portion of everything for the next 2 months. And Pete Garza, who had been sleeping in the livery 2 nights a week since the fire, finally moved back to the ranch full-time with the observation that his back was grateful. The ranch in the spring was a revelation to Mamie, who had grown up in a city and spent her adult years in the small, contained spaces of newspaper offices and boarding houses. The land came alive in ways she had not expected, the dry creek filling with snowmelt from the mountains, the desert going briefly and extravagantly green before settling into its characteristic spare beauty, the mornings so clear and cold and bright that they felt like a physical gift. She learned the work of the ranch with the same methodical energy she brought to everything, not taking over, because it was Monroe's life, and his knowledge was vast and rooted in years of practice, but learning, absorbing, asking questions that Monroe answered with pleasure because he loved being asked, loved having someone to share the knowledge with. She kept the courier going. The twice-monthly schedule became weekly again as the summer progressed, because there was more to cover, because Dusty Creek was growing, because the railroad news became more concrete and more urgent and required consistent attention. She wrote about the railroad's approach, about what it would mean for land values and for commerce, about the importance of ordinary residents understanding and participating in the decisions that would shape their community. The courier's circulation grew past Dusty Creek into the surrounding townships, and Mamie hired a second assistant, a quiet, precise woman named Helen Marsh, who had been a schoolteacher and had excellent handwriting and a gift for the organizing of information. In late summer, Mamie had a conversation with Monroe on the porch of the ranch house one evening after supper, in the last of the day's light, with the desert cooling around them and the first stars appearing, as precise and clear as type on a pale page. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her, and his expression was immediately attentive in the way it always was when she had something to say, fully turned toward her, giving her his complete attention, which was one of the things she loved most about him. "We are going to have a child," she said. Monroe was very still for a moment. Then he reached across and took her hand, and his grip was warm and careful, and she could feel the emotion he was holding very steadily, the way he held most things, containing them so they did not spill over and frighten anyone, which was a habit she was slowly helping him be less rigorous about. "Mamie," he said, and his voice was different, deeper, full of something that was too large for speaking but was there in the sound of her name. "In the spring," she said, "if I have my timing right." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said with a care that was entirely typical of him, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am very well," she said, squeezing his hand. "I have never felt better." He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, steady and strong and fast, faster than usual, and she thought this right here was everything. "A child," he said, half to himself, like a man testing the weight of a word. "A baby," she said, smiling. He looked at her with the open Monroe face, entirely unguarded, and his eyes were bright in the last of the evening light, and he said, "I did not know I was still allowed to want this." "You are," she said softly. "You are absolutely allowed." He pulled her close with the careful, certain gentleness that was entirely his, and she leaned against him, and the desert night settled around them with its ancient stars and its clean, cool air and its endlessly patient silence. Pete Garza's reaction when told the following morning was a single nod, and the declaration that he was going to fix the fence on the south pasture before winter, because the new arrangement clearly required the ranch to be in better structural repair, which was Pete's way of saying he was very pleased. Sam and Dill Vickers said congratulations simultaneously, and then got into a brief argument about who had said it first. Toby Reeves, when Mamie told him at the newspaper office, broke into an enormous grin and said he could run the Tuesday edition entirely on his own if she needed to rest, which made Mamie laugh and tell him she was not resting until the baby arrived and possibly not for some time after. Clara said, "I knew it," with deep satisfaction, and made a soup. The winter was a good one, quiet and productive. The ranch was warm and well-stocked. Monroe was attentive in every practical way without being overbearing, which was a balance Mamie appreciated deeply, because she was not a woman who required hovering. He had built her a writing desk in the room off the kitchen, a proper work desk with good light from a window he had enlarged specifically for the purpose, and she wrote her courier pieces there in the mornings when the light was best. They read in the evenings by the fire, and they talked about everything, about the child who was coming, about the paper's future, about the ranch, about the territory and what it was becoming, about the books they were working through together now, which had expanded to include a battered volume of history Monroe had ordered from a bookseller in Santa Fe, and which they argued about with the pleasure of two people who enjoy a good argument. Their son was born in April of 1875 in the bedroom of the ranch house, with a midwife from town named Mrs. Doyle and Clara and Ruth Hardin in attendance, and Monroe in the room because Mamie had told him clearly that she wanted him there, and because he would not have been anywhere else in any case. He was a healthy, vigorous boy from his first moment, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and Monroe held him with the particular careful awe of a man who cannot quite believe what he is holding. "What shall we name him?" Monroe asked, his voice very soft in the quiet room. Mamie, tired and entirely satisfied, looked at the small person she had made. "Earl," she said. "For Earl Sutton, because without that old press I never would have come here." Monroe looked up at her with his open face and said, "Yes, just that." But in the yes was everything. Earl Sutton Barker was a serious, curious child almost from the beginning. He had strong opinions about things at an age when other children were still primarily concerned with eating, and he had a habit of watching adults with a focused attention that they found occasionally unsettling and mostly endearing. Monroe introduced him to the ranch with the same patient thoroughness with which he did everything, and Mamie brought him to the newspaper office from the time he was old enough to sit propped against her arm while she set type, and he watched the letters with a focus that suggested he already understood that they meant something, that they were important, that they were the foundation of order in a complicated world. Dusty Creek grew. The railroad spur came through in 1876, just as had been predicted, and with it came new families, a doctor, a school, and two competing general stores that drove Hector Pyle to upgrade his inventory and his manor simultaneously. The Courier grew with the town, moving to a larger building, acquiring a second press, adding a third day of publication. Helen Marsh became the paper's managing editor while Mamie shifted to writing and editorial direction, because Earl required more of her time than she had anticipated, and because, as Monroe pointed out with careful tact, she did not actually have to do every task herself. This was a lesson Mamie was still working on. Monroe built the ranch carefully and steadily over those years, adding to the herd and improving the pasture land, and working closely with Pete Garza, who was as much a partner as a foreman by now, and who had developed a very strong, entirely unspoken bond with Earl, who followed Pete around the ranch with the dedicated attention of a small anthropologist studying an important subject. The town elected a mayor and a town council in 1876, and at the first meeting of the council, Monroe Barker was elected to a seat without, he said, entirely agreeing to run, which was probably true because he would not have sought it, but which was an outcome that surprised no one. He served with the same quiet, steady competence he brought to everything, advocating for a proper school building and a system for maintaining the town's water supply now that the railroad had brought its particular changes to the landscape. The injustices of the land were not all resolved, and Mamie knew it. She wrote about it in the Courier with the same methodical care she brought to everything else, documenting the ways in which the territory's growth continued to displace families who had less power than those pressing against them, writing about the Apache communities to the south, whose lands were being consistently violated by both settlers and the territorial government, calling for acknowledgement of the patterns of harm, even when the solutions were not simple or immediate. She did not pretend these matters were resolved. She kept them in print, kept them present, because a newspaper's job is to tell the truth and to tell it plainly, with fairness to the facts and none to the powerful. And the powerful in 1876 New Mexico Territory were still very powerful indeed, and the people being displaced were still losing. Monroe read everything she wrote. Sometimes he agreed with all of it. Sometimes they argued, and those arguments were among the best conversations of their lives. Two people who respected each other challenging each other's thinking, both of them leaving the argument different than they entered it. In 1877, they had a second child, a daughter, born in September, bright and fierce from her first breath. They named her Clara, after the woman who had pushed two cautious people to stop circling and say what they felt, which Clara herself received with loud proclamations of delight and the immediate production of a christening quilt. Earl took his role as older sibling with great seriousness, presenting his sister with a smooth desert stone that he had selected personally and considered to be a valuable gift. Monroe accepted this development with the profound pleasure of a man who had once thought that the life he had was the complete life, and has since discovered that it was only the beginning. The years of Dusty Creek in the late 1870s were years of building and change and the ordinary extraordinary work of living, and Mamie and Monroe lived them fully, with all the texture and difficulty and joy that fully lived years contain. There were droughts and good rains and cattle losses, and a season when the ranch came very close to serious financial trouble before Monroe, Pete, and Mamie together worked out a solution involving a shared grazing arrangement with the Miller farm that turned the year around. There were courier editions that caused controversy and ones that were celebrated, and at least two occasions when Mamie's editorials prompted letters of furious response that she printed alongside her own patient, reasoned replies. There were town meetings and school plays, and the particular long conversations of married people who are also genuinely interested in each other, who do not run out of things to say. Monroe changed over those years, slowly, and with the kind of depth that slow change carries. The weight that Mamie had seen on him that first day had shifted entirely into something else, something not lighter exactly but different in its character, the weight of a full life, of love that is real and present and daily and not theoretical. His smile, which had once been cautious and rationed, became easier, more habitual, his own. He was a good father with the particular quality of attention and patience that Mamie had loved in him from the beginning, and Earl and Clara responded to it by being, in their different ways, deeply secure children who trusted the world more than they probably should have, and who would spend their whole lives testing and refining that trust into wisdom. Earl, at 5, discovered that the letters in the type cases of the courier made words, and that words made sentences, and that sentences in large enough numbers made meaning, and he stood at his mother's type case for an entire afternoon while Mamie, fighting a smile, answered his questions about what each letter was and what it sounded like. And when she came back from a different task 20 minutes later, she found that he had carefully, deliberately set his own name in the composing stick, EARL. Using a 6-point typeface and with one letter slightly crooked, she kept that line of type for the rest of her life, in a small wooden box on the shelf above her writing desk. Clara, at 3, declared her intention to be the sheriff of Dusty Creek, a position that the town now had, held by a capable man named Jim Stokes, and spent a considerable period of time following Stokes around town with the focused dedication that she had inherited directly from her mother, until Stokes, with great good humor, deputized her in a small unofficial ceremony that Mamie wrote about in the Courier with the particular fondness of a journalist who knows exactly what material her readers will love. Monroe read that piece 3 times. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house one evening in the late summer of 1879, with the desert going from amber to rose to deep violet in the way it did on the best evenings, when Monroe said, out of a comfortable silence, "Do you remember the first evening I came to the newspaper office?" "You came every evening," Mamie said, looking out at the sky. "The first one," he said. "You were sorting the type cases. You did not look up for 10 minutes. I was working, she said. I know, he said. I knew it then. I thought, this is a woman who knows what she is doing and is not going to stop doing it on my account. He paused. I thought it was the most attractive thing I had ever seen. Mamie looked at him, and he was looking at her with the open, certain face that she had spent 6 years learning and never tired of. You were carrying something very heavy, she said softly. I was, he said. I am not now, or I am carrying it differently. He looked at her. You did that. We did that, she said, together. He reached across and took her hand in the way he had since the beginning, the careful, certain way that had never stopped being tender. And they sat together on the porch of the ranch house. They had made a home, watching the desert evening complete itself in colors that no Eastern painter could have imagined, with the sounds of their children inside, and the horses in the pasture, and the night beginning its quiet work across the vast New Mexico sky. The Dusty Creek Courier ran its 100th edition in the fall of 1879. Mamie wrote the editorial herself, sitting at the writing desk Monroe had built for her, in the room with the good morning light, with Earl doing his school lessons at the kitchen table, where she could hear him working and Clara making a series of emphatic sounds in the back garden that suggested she was conducting an important negotiation with the chickens. The editorial was about what a newspaper was for, which was the thing Mamie had always known, not just to carry information but to carry the community to itself, to hold up the mirror and say, here is what you are, here is what you have done, here is what you might yet become. It was about Earl Sutton and his careful press and what he had left behind. It was about the people of Dusty Creek who had trusted the paper with their stories and their evidence and their outrage and their hope. It was about the imperfect, necessary, ongoing work of truth-telling in a complicated world. At the end of it she wrote simply, this paper exists because this community exists, because the people of Dusty Creek chose to believe that the truth, told plainly and with care, was worth the effort of telling. We are still choosing that. We will keep on choosing it. Monroe read it before it went out, as he always did, and he set it down and looked at her across the work table with the expression she had stopped finding words for because words were not adequate to it, and he said, this is the best thing you have written. You say that every time, she said, and every time I am right, he said. She laughed, and the morning light was good in the newspaper office, and outside the window Dusty Creek was going about its business, the noise and dust and ordinary life of a community that was still imperfect and still trying and still here, still pressing forward into whatever the next years would bring. Pete Garza retired from the foreman position in 1880 at the age of 52, and Monroe hired his replacement, a young man from south of the territory named Alejandro Reyes, who was 23 and skilled, and who learned the Barker Ranch's ways with a speed that impressed everyone, and who showed up at the newspaper office one Thursday afternoon to ask Helen Marsh a question about a land registry notice that turned into a 2-hour conversation that Clara Barker, now 3 years old, observed with the dedicated attention of a born journalist and subsequently reported to her parents in considerable detail. Monroe and Mamie looked at each other across the supper table after this report. She notices everything, Monroe said. She gets that from you, Mamie said. She gets it from both of us, Monroe said, which was fair. Pete Garza stayed in Dusty Creek because he had no intention of leaving a place where he was known and respected, and where a small girl called him Uncle Pete and climbed onto his lap with complete confidence. And he bought himself a small house on the east side of town and spent his retirement doing exactly what he wanted, which was tending a garden, playing cards with a group of men his age, and continuing to hold deeply considered opinions about every major decision made on the Barker Ranch, which Monroe consulted him on with perfect seriousness. In 1881, the territorial court issued its final ruling in the consolidated case arising from the Blevins investigation. The ruling established clear precedents for what constituted coercive land acquisition in the territory and provided a legal mechanism for settlers who had been similarly pressured to seek remedy. It was not a perfect outcome. The law was slow and imperfect, and there were people who had been displaced who would not be made fully whole by any court proceeding. But it was something real, something on the record, something that would be cited in subsequent cases, and would make it harder for the next Cord Blevins to do what this one had done with such impunity for so long. Mamie ran the ruling on the front page of the Courier, with a full analysis of what it meant and what it did not mean, and what work remained to be done. She also ran a brief item at the bottom of the page, without editorial comment, noting that the Dusty Creek Courier had first reported on the pattern of coercive water rights acquisition in September of 1873, which was now 8 years ago. The Territorial Press Association, which had been established in Santa Fe in 1878, awarded the Courier its citation for public service journalism. Mamie received the letter informing her of the award on a Tuesday morning and read it, set it down, told Toby, who was now the Courier's senior printer and had grown into a capable and devoted member of the paper's staff, and then went back to editing the piece she had been working on about the new school expansion. Toby framed the letter and hung it on the wall without asking permission, on the grounds that Mamie would not have done it herself. On a Saturday in early autumn of 1881, Monroe and Mamie rode together out to the valley he had first shown her, the one with the dry creek bed that ran silver in the right light and the desert sage that made the air smell like something old and clean. It was a familiar ride now, one they made several times a year, their horses knowing the way as well as their riders. Earl was 10 by now and would sometimes come with them, riding his own horse with the careful competence of a boy who had grown up in the saddle, but today it was just the two of them. They stopped at the edge of the valley, as always, and looked out at it in the particular quiet that had its own language now, the quiet of two people who have been through enough together that silence between them is not empty but full. The valley was the same as it always was, spare and beautiful and enormous, with the sky going a deep blue above it and the light falling clean across the red hills. 8 years, Monroe said. 8 years, Mamie agreed. He looked at her. You were going to change this town. I wanted to keep a press running, she said. The town changed itself. You made it possible, he said. She looked at him, at the face she had been looking at for 8 years, which she still found she could look at with the same quality of attention she had given it that first evening in the red cactus, the careful, particular attention of someone recognizing something important. The lines were a little deeper now. The dark hair had threads of silver at the temples. The weight that she had seen on him the first day was gone entirely, replaced by something that was its own kind of substance, something settled and full. Monroe, she said, yes. I think we are very fortunate people. He considered this with the thoroughness he brought to every true proposition. Yes, he said, we are. He reached across and took her hand, and the horses stood easy in the afternoon light, and the valley spread before them, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to human affairs in the specific way of landscapes that have been present for geologic ages and will be present long after every human story is finished, which was in its own way a comfort, being part of something that large and that old and that continuous. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and Clara came running from the garden when she heard the horses, shouting something about the chickens and a disputed matter of territory that required parental arbitration, and Earl came around from the barn with Pete Garza at his side, both of them carrying the serious expressions of men who had been working on something complicated and had made progress on it. The ranch was full of the sounds and smells of an autumn evening, wood smoke and cooking and horses and dry grass, and the light was going golden and long across the yard. Monroe helped Mamie down from her horse as he always did, not because she needed it but because he wanted to, the touch deliberate and gentle and entirely habitual, and she held his hand for a moment after her feet touched the ground, just the hand, and looked up at him. He looked back at her, the open Monroe face, the certain, warm, alive Monroe face. "Supper," she said. "Supper," he agreed. And they went inside together, into the warm and busy house, into the life they had made from a carpetbag and a press, and a letter placed in a Kansas City paper by a man who did not expect anyone to answer, and an evening in a saloon when two careful people looked at each other, and a door began, slowly and with great patience, to open. The Dusty Creek Courier ran for decades more. Its files were eventually donated to the Territorial Archives in Santa Fe, where they sat as a meticulous record of a community making itself, year by year, through trouble and weather and change. Earl Barker learned every part of its operation from his mother, as she had learned from her father, and by the time he was 20, he was writing its news columns with a clarity and an honesty that people said was entirely his mother's work, which pleased Mamie and which Monroe received with the expression of a man who knows he is witnessing something continuous, something that will go on past him, which is the only kind of legacy that matters. Clara Barker did, in fact, become a figure of law in Dusty Creek, though not a sheriff, but a justice of the peace, a position she held with the same fierce and focused competence she had brought to every task since she was 3 years old. And Jim Stokes, long since retired and very old, attended her inaugural sitting and said he was not surprised at all, which everyone knew was not entirely true but was true enough. Pete Garza's garden was the finest in the county, and he permitted children to come and look at it on Saturday mornings, provided they did not touch anything he had not specifically offered, which was a rule Earl had broken twice at the age of 7, and then never again. Monroe Barker served 2 terms on the town council and declined a 3rd, on the grounds that Dusty Creek had grown enough to have people better suited to the administrative work than a rancher, which was possibly true, but mostly he had decided he wanted the time back, wanted the evenings on the porch and the Saturday rides and the long conversations with his wife by the fire, wanted all of it in full measure, without apology. Because a man who has learned late in life that the days are not merely something to be gotten through would like, thereafter, to live them as completely as possible. He did. They both did. And Dusty Creek, which had been a tired, dusty, lean little place in the spring of 1873, when a woman rode into it with a carpetbag and a rifle and a letter of inquiry about an old press, grew into something real and complicated and alive, the way communities do when someone believes they are worth the effort of truth-telling, when someone looks at a place that has nearly forgotten what hope looks like and sees, instead, what it might become.